Hey guys, welcome back to my channel today. In today's video, we are going to be talking about the new Hourglass Ambient Edit Volume 4. This is very, very exciting because they have released this now for the 4th year in a row. I do have the Ambient Edit Volume 3 from last year. I also have the new Unlocked palette, which is right here. And I also have the palette from 2 years ago as well, which is in Surreal light. This one is a little bit different as well. So I will be comparing the new Ambient Edit 4 to all of these, as well as let you know all the deets on this new palette and if I think it is worth your money or not. If you guys are new here, hello, my name is Jenna Fraze. Thanks so much for hanging out with me today. I chat about high-end and luxury makeup, so of course Hourglass is a part of that category. So if you are interested in high-end makeup like myself and you just love it, then I would love for you to consider subscribing to my channel before we get started. And without further ado, let's get on to my review of this new palette as well as some comparisons and swatches for you guys. First of all, let's talk about the Hourglass Ambient Edit Volume 4. This of course has an ultra metallic, very reflective packaging, just like the previous year's Ambient Edit palette, as well as the Unlocked palette. It is very stunning packaging, but of course it's going to show some fingerprints, so if that's not something that you're into, then just keep that in mind. When you open it up, you will have these 6 pans of product themselves. They are stunning. The first 2 powders are finishing powders. The first one is in dim light, the second one is in diffuse light. Then the third powder is the strobing powder. This is in euphoric strobe light. The 4th pan is the bronzer and it is in filtered bronze light. Then we have the 2 blushes, the first being luminous glow and the second being a strobe blush in euphoric fusion. This palette is available right now on the Sephora app in the early access section for VIB and for Rouge members. However, it will be available to all beauty insiders on October 12th. This palette does retail for 80 American dollars or 95 Canadian dollars. Hourglass did make some changes to this formula in this year's Ambient Edit Volume 4. So they've always been a cruelty-free brand, but now they are a vegan brand as well. So all of these powders are also vegan, just like in the Ambient Unlocked palette, which is awesome. When I was applying my makeup today, the first powder that I use is actually the Dim Light Finishing Powder, which is right here. I love how this is a neutral beigey shade. It is perfect for light skin tones in my opinion. I actually had no issues applying it myself. It was not too dark for me, but just keep in mind this is not a translucent powder and none of these finishing powders are actually translucent. So just keep that in mind. Next, I wanted to add a little bit more brightness to the center of my face. So I did use the second powder here, which is in diffuse light. This powder definitely has a slight yellow undertone to it, but it's a lot brighter and a lot more light. So it is going to give you that brightening effect to the skin. Next, I use the strobing powder as my highlight. This is in Euphoric Strobe Light. It's the 3rd one here on the palette in the top row. This one is part of their permanent collection. So far, all of these shades are from other palettes or their permanent collection. This strobing powder is very, very natural. It's definitely that lit from within kind of look that belongs to the Hourglass kind of brand. It's very, very stunning, but for me with the look I did today, I had to put about 4 layers on it because I kind of wanted it to be shown a little bit more than just subtly. So you can definitely do a subtle effect where it's just like healthy skin, or you can kind of give it a little bit more oomph and just like apply a few layers over top of each other. There are 2 blushes in this Ambient Edit 4 palette. The first one is the blush here in Luminous Glow. This is a new shade exclusive to the palette, and this one is a really peachy, like sheen kind of blush, so it's a beautiful glowy blush. I didn't use this one today, but as you can see from the swatches, it's really, really stunning. You can tell it's like a beautiful, like glowy blush, which I love. Then the blush that I did use today is the strobing blush here. This is in Euphoric Fusion. This is from their permanent line. I actually have Euphoric Fusion in a single right here. I have Euphoric Fusion in the trio right here. Like I have this blush all over the place. So if you are a blush collector and you have that one, note that this is also a repeat from their permanent line, but this one I applied to the skin today. It is a beautiful, soft lilac kind of sheeny blush. Like it's really, really stunning. I do think the goldenness of this blush definitely appears more in the pigment versus the lilac. It's just a little bit of a beautiful lilac undertone. So this one is really, really flattering, I think, for a lot of different skin tones. So I do like this shade and I'm glad that it's in this palette as well. The last shade in this palette is the bronzer. bronzer. This is also the last step of my makeup routine, and this is in Filtered Bronze Light. It is a new exclusive shade to this palette. This bronzer to me is a little bit cooler, and I do really enjoy this. I think it's light. It also has that sheeniness to it, which is kind of like the whole idea of an Hourglass Ambient powder just in general. Overall, I am really impressed with this Ambient Edit Volume 4 palette. I do think that it is probably ideal for fair, light, and maybe light to medium skin tones. Once you hit the medium skin tone, I do think that the brightening finishing powder will maybe look a little bit like a white cast, and that the bronzer may be too light for you. The first palette I want to compare the new Ambient Edit Volume 4 to is actually the palette from 2 years ago, and this is the Ambient Edit in Surreal Light. Out of all the Ambient Edit palettes, I do think this one is slightly drier than the rest of them, and I do think they perform a little bit more drying on the skin, but it's not to me a deal breaker because I have normal skin. If you have dry skin, then I think you would have like the biggest impact with this guy, but this one is no longer available, so I'm not going to touch on it too much, but I do think that these powders are nowhere near the same as this one here. So if this is the only other palette you have, you can definitely justify getting the new one. Next, I want to compare the new Ambient Edit 4 palette next to last year's Ambient Volume 3 palette. So basically, when I was looking at both of them side by side, what I did find, of course, is this year's palette does have the vegan cruelty-free formula, whereas last year's palette just has the cruelty-free formula. So there is a touch of creaminess to this year's palette versus last. The finishing powders between the two of them are identical. Both of them have dim light and diffuse light as their finishing powders, which is really too bad. I kind of wished for a little bit more variety between the two, but it is what it is. When it comes to the strobe powders though, both of them are like the natural strobe powders. They do not have the metallic finishes. They are very similar as well. That is just my opinion. I see very little difference between the two. The only thing I do see is that the Ambient Edit 4 has a little bit more of a warmer gold undertone, whereas the last year's palette has a bit of a cooler gold undertone, but it's so slight that I don't think it's going to make the biggest difference when applied to the skin. The bronzer in last year's palette is Luminous Bronze Light, which is from their permanent collection. This one is a warm bronzer that's ideal for light to medium skin tones, and this bronzer is definitely warmer and a little bit more golden compared to this year's Ambient palette. Then we have the blushes, which of course are a little bit different from this year's palette. The blushes in last year's palette are both limited edition, not from the permanent collection at all, so I haven't seen them again in any of Hourglass's palettes. We do have one that is also more of a lilac shade, but this one is much more lilac looking versus the golden lilac that we see in this year's palette. This year's palette is definitely more golden, less lilac, whereas last year's palette is much more lilac in color. Then we have the coral blushes in each palette, and last year's Ambient Edit definitely had more of a coral pink color. It's much more of a pink undertone, whereas this year's palette is much more of a golden kind of coral peach color. So now the question is, if you have last year's palette, do you need this year's palette? I do think the answer is going to be up to you. I do think the biggest variability between the shades, of course, is the blush and the bronzer. I think the highlight is very similar, and of course the finishing powders are identical. So it's already half of the palette being very, very close to the other palette. So that's just up to you. If you think that half the palette is worth getting a brand new palette for, then sounds good, awesome. If you're an Hourglass fan, you'll probably be able to justify that as well. But if you're wanting something completely different, then I don't think that this new palette is going to give that to you, because they do have the same kind of themes with the coral and the lilac blushes. It's just that the finishes vary a little bit different, and the bronzer is actually pretty close, with one being warmer and one being cooler. Lastly, let's talk about the Ambient Edit 4 versus the Unlocked palette. This is the Unlocked palette here, and as you guys can see, just as a general theme, this one is definitely deeper as a whole versus the Ambient Edit 4. The finishing powder here, the brightening powder, is a beautiful brightening powder. It kind of reminds me of Luminous Light, which is a beautiful brightening finishing powder in their permanent line. Then we have the finishing powder here, which is definitely a lot deeper than the finishing powder in the Ambient Volume 4. The bronzer in this palette is definitely a bit warmer than the bronzer in the Volume 4 palette. The two blushes between the palettes are very different as well. We have this beautiful kind of deeper dusty rose, which is a matte, and this one here is a nude peachy shade as well, a little bit deeper with more of a sheen, but again, nowhere near the shades that are in Volume 4. Lastly, we have the strobing powder in this palette here. This one is a metallic as well, so that makes it very, very different compared to the Volume 4. Volume 4 has the regular strobe lighting kind of highlight formula, which is much more subtle, much more natural. This one is a little bit more blinding because it's the metallic finish. It's easier to build up to get more of that blinding effect, but you can still keep it really subtle and beautiful as well. All in all, you guys, I do think that the Unlocked palette is different enough that you can justify purchasing both of them if you are interested in both. Anyways, guys, those are my thoughts on this brand new Ambient Volume 4 palette. Let me know down below, are you guys thinking about purchasing this? What do you guys think of it? Again, if you have last year's palette, that's just going to depend on how much of a variability you're wanting with this new palette, if you're able to justify it or not. But the Unlocked palette, I think, is a lot different compared to the Volume 4, so you can absolutely justify getting both of those if you think they'll both fit for your skin tone. If you guys enjoyed this video, don't forget to let me know by giving it a big thumbs up, as well as don't forget to subscribe. I'd love to see you guys back here, and until my next one, guys, take care. Thanks so much for watching. Bye!
You and me, everything that we've been through has made us strong. You won't believe we've had our gray, but somewhere there's a light inside of us.